Welcome back to MLFL. I'm super happy to have Andrew Lee with us today. Andrew is hosted by Martin Wattenberg and Fernanda Viegas. He completed his PhD in computer science at the University of Michigan. His research interests are around model interpretability, understanding feature representations, and the role that they play. His research has been recognized by top machine learning and natural language processing venues and was awarded an Outstanding Paper Award at Column 2025, an oral presentation at ICML 2024, and a spotlight at NeurIPS 2024. And with that, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. And thanks for the intro. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm a postdoc at Harvard, and today I'm going to be talking about how to interpret attention heads. And so in particular, I think a recent trend in interpretability has been all about decomposition. And so if you've heard about sparse autoencoders, that's a typical example where we want to decompose, say, the model's components, whether it's activations or even parameters, into interpretable components. And once we have these interpretable blocks or components, we can then build things like circuits on top of them to reverse engineer what the model is doing. But we still don't know actually how to interpret attention heads. And so in a lot of these analyses, we just keep like the attention patterns from the model fixed, and those are still almost treated as black boxes. And often we might try to visualize what these heads are doing. So for instance, here on the left, given a prompt like the doctor asked the nurse a question and we can see that the model is attending to the word nurse. And so we might qualitatively suggest, oh, maybe this is a case of gender bias. Or maybe you've seen attention head visualizations like this, where you can see here the model attending to every other token. But we don't know why um, these patterns are being formed, right? So given a very, very simple question, like why did an attention head attend to token X, we don't have a good answer for this question. Let me go through how attention works very quickly. If you're familiar with transformers, this may be a review for you. But assuming we have some activations for the input prompt at some arbitrary layer, the first thing the model will do is construct key vectors using the weight matrix WK. It will also create query vectors using the weight matrix WQ. And then it takes the dot product between our Ks and Qs, or our key vectors and query vectors. This gives us some scalar value that I'll call attention logits. And of course, we're doing this for all pairs of keys and queries. And so once we have our attention logits, we feed this through a softmax to compute attention scores. So these are now normalized probability distributions between 0 and 1. In parallel, the model will also create value vectors using weight matrix WV. It's going to scale these value vectors based on the attention pattern that it computed earlier with the Qs and Ks. And then we're simply going to take the weighted sum of our value vectors, project this back out to the model's activation space using our W out or WO weight matrix. Right. So on the QK side, where this is the part that determines the attention scores, where the model will decides to spend its attention. We're essentially asking when we ask why did an attention head attend to this token, we're essentially asking why did the model produce this dot product? And I think the reason why this has been tricky is because if you consider the dot product, you're left with a single scalar value, and that's the end of the story. Um, and we don't know where this dot product is coming from. But instead, if we were to look at what I call the QK space or the query key space, which is you can almost think of this as just as the outer product of your Qs and Ks, then we can actually identify interpretable structure. So here, more formally, the QK space is referring to the joint bilinear embedding space between your Qs and Ks. Or put differently, it's a space of all possible interactions that can take place between your queries and keys. But you can again just think of your it's easier for me at least to think of this as just the outer product between queries and keys. Um, and the goal is now then to decompose this structure, your QK space, into interpretable subspaces. Let me take a pause here and see if there are any questions. No, otherwise I'll keep going. So that's the goal today. We're going to look at this object that I call the QK space, and we're going to think of ways of decomposing this. So I'm going to start with a very simple toy task and a toy model to kind of explain our method. And then I'm going to show you results of applying our method on real LLMs. And the high level idea behind our method is that keys and queries are basically being quote unquote tagged with low rank features. And basically, when your keys and queries share the same set of tags, then that produces high attention scores. So here in this example, imagine that, for instance, we have a set of keys, and K0, for instance, is tagged with features A, Z, and P. K1 is tagged with features X and Z, and so on. Whereas our query vector is tagged with features X and Z. And so here the model is going to attend to keys that share the same set of tags. So for instance, it'll spend some attention on K0, K1, and KT because it shares tag Z. It will also attend partially to K1 and K2 because it shares tag X. But in this example, it would spend most of the attention on K1 because it shares the same set of tags X, both X and Z. So with that being said, here I'll go through a very simple task. It's simple on paper, but it's kind of it's quite low level to explain in a talk. So bear with me and feel free to stop me if there are any questions. But here we're going to construct a set of what I call payload embeddings. So each of these X of I are what I call payload embeddings that are each encoding some payload information. And you can just think of a payload as some class label. And at the same time, we have our query embedding. And here, the query embedding will be encoding where or which of these payload embeddings to attend to in order to retrieve the correct payload. And we're only going to train a single attention head on this data, where the attention head, again, will use X of Q to know which payload embedding to attend to decode the correct payload information. And so we're not training any sort of MLPs, residual connections, any transformer blocks. We're literally just training these weights, WQ, K, V, and O. And the way we construct these payload embeddings is where the whole tag information now comes in. So to construct a single payload information, each payload embedding basically consists of three components. It's going to consist of two latent variables, Z1 and Z2. And so these Z1 and Z2 variables are basically the tags that I was saying earlier. And this other component being the payload encoding or some class label. Um, so for each latent variable, Z1 and Z2, we're going to randomly sample a vector of length R1 and length R2. And the values of each latent variable can only be 1 or -1. So here in this example, imagine that R1 is 3. So the first latent variable only has length 3, and R2 is 5. And so our second latent variable can have length 5. And we're randomly sampling values 1 and -1. So imagine Z1 here is 1, 1, -1, whereas Z2 would be 1, -1, -1, 1, -1. So once we've randomly sampled some value for Z1 and Z2, we're going to embed this into the payload embedding space using what I call loading matrices A1 and A2. So A1 and A2 are also going to be random matrices, but we're going to keep this fixed throughout the whole process of generating our toy data. Lastly, we also want to encode our payload class label. And so we're going to randomly sample between 1 and let's say 10. Let's say we have 10 possible values for our class labels. So we're going to randomly sample 1. And then we're also going to embed that into our embedding space using a different loading matrix A of y. So put differently, basically now our each payload embedding is going to be simply the sum of these three components. One latent variable, one latent variable Z1, another latent variable Z2, and some class or payload embedding, where here E of y is just a one-hot encoding of our class label. Does this make sense so far? I'll take a pause here as well. This might seem like arbitrary at the moment, and I hope by the time I go through the entire toy task, this will make more sense. But for now, assume we have constructed a bunch of payload embeddings. So each payload embedding consists of three parts, two latent variables, and a class or payload embedding or payload, information. Now we want to construct a query embedding. So the query embedding, to do so, we're going to randomly select one of the target payloads, and let's call that index I star. And at this target payload, we already know what latent variables were used to construct this payload embedding. Um, and so we're just going to reuse the same latent variable Z1 and Z2 from this payload embedding to construct our query embedding, but now using a different loading matrix B1 and B2. So very similar as before, our query embedding is going to be the sum of two components, some encoding of Z1 and some encoding of Z2. Importantly, in this case, the query embedding does not contain any sort of payload information. It only contains information about the latent variables. So to summarize, each payload embedding consists of three components, Z1, Z2, and some payload information, whereas a query embedding only has two components, Z1 and Z2. But the Z1 and Z2 from the query side is coming from one of the target payload embeddings. Right, so essentially we can do this. This is our training data for our toy task. We're constructing, like per training sample, we're constructing a set of payload embeddings, a query embedding. We know what the target index is, and we know what the target payload is at that index. So with that being said, let's walk through how a single attention head would be trained on this data. So here we have a bunch of payload embeddings and a query vector, and a query embedding. And again, we're only going to train these weights, WK, WQ, WV, and WO. So first thing we're going to do is use WK to construct our key vectors. So this is where WK comes in. Next, we're going to use WQ to construct our query vectors. We're going to go through the whole dot product and normalization to construct attention scores. And in parallel, we're also going to construct value vectors using WV. We're going to take their weighted sum and then project out using WO. But importantly here for WO, normally when you look at transformers, the projection in WO is from your attention head's like hidden space to back to the transformer's activation space. But here we're just going to project out to the output classification space directly, where here we're directly making a prediction of what the payload was here. And so using this, we can use basically softmax to decide on a class label. And we're going to use cross entropy to match whether the decoded payload information matches the ground truth payload information at the target index. So here what the model needs to do essentially is it has to use Q's and K's to produce high attention scores when your keys and vectors share the same two latent variables. Basically, it has to use W, Q, and K to know where to attend to fetch the correct payload. And then it has to use WV and WO to then decode the actual payload information from the payload embedding. Um, right. So let me take a pause here and take questions. Yeah, I see one on Zoom.
Hi, Andrew. I just have a clarification question. So
Yeah.
a different T, different position, it will be different Y.
Yes, yes, yes.
And the training objectives is gonna be depending on a Y at a certain T. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Any other questions? Clarification questions? Yeah.
I'm I might have missed this when you did the initial setup, but is there a sequence of tokens here or any sense of position, or is this just like a one-shot classification kind of task?
There's no like, so we have indices in the sense that we have a set of payload embeddings, but there's no notion of like time position. Like there's no first, second, and third. Sorry, like there's no notion of one embedding coming before the other. And so there's no sort of like payload. Sorry, there's no position encoding needed here. Did
Okay.
that answer your question?
Yeah.
If this setup doesn't make sense, we can like I can go back and try to explain it better. Because I think this part is um, important for like the next method explanation part. Otherwise, I'll keep going. Um,
Uh,
um,
I guess
yeah,
one other thing that it might help to clarify, could you provide a little intuition on that first bullet of like um, the ideal solution is when Q and K are maximally aligned when the two features match.
yeah. Okay, so another way to think of this is if I go back to how this data is being constructed. So each of these payload embeddings is being tagged with three things. One is Z1, the other is Z2, and the last one is the actual payload embedding that needs to be retrieved. And so basically, you can think of each of these payload embeddings saying, hey, whenever your query side has a particular Z1 value, let's say 1, 1, -1, and whenever your query side has a particular Z2 value, um, attend to me because I have the payload information that you're looking for. And so going back to the whole like tag analogy, you can think of this as saying the payload as this payload saying like, hey, I have tags X and Z. And so on the query side, if you're looking for tags X and Z, then attend to me. And so with that kind of tagging scheme, then um, like when your data is constructed that way, then going back to this picture, um, like WQ and WK is now reading from these query and payload embeddings. And so we want these vectors, this pink and blue vector, to be highly aligned when they share the same set of tags, because then that will produce high attention scores. But we want them to be different when you're not sharing the same tags so that you don't basically attend to that position. I don't know if that was helpful or if that made it more confusing. Yeah.
What's the why use two latents instead of just like one with a shared matrix?
Um, it might have worked with one. I think when I go through the method, I think it would be clear why we needed two.
Cool. Yeah, thank you.
And we could have used more than two as well, but to keep it simple, we kept it at two. And I guess also the hypothesis is that there are multiple tags used by attention heads, and so we want, I guess, more than one.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
I guess one other question. I noticed that you deliberately use the word tag instead of feature, the way that typically folks who use like SAEs and all of these other things do. Is there a reason for that? Like, how should I
I
think
guess
about them
I've been
differently?
using them interchangeably. Tags and feature, I guess, to me, I mean the same thing.
So similarly, like the way we often think of activations as like a linear combination of features, like directions in feature space. Like,
Mhm.
am I thinking similarly as like keys and queries are like a linear sum of tags and like in that space?
So I think a distinction that I want to make here with the whole like directional feature is that instead, um, um, what we find is basically, actually, let me come back to that point in a few slides because once I show some examples, I think it would make more clear what I want to say later. But for now, think of features as a subspace instead of a one-dimensional direction. And in that low rank subspace, like the coordinates in that low rank subspace determines a feature value, basically. But I think this will make more sense once we look at some examples.
Okay, that's helpful.
Okay, so basically going back to the original question, we were asking like, how do we interpret attention heads? And my whole pitch was, well, let's look at the outer product, the QK transpose, and decompose that. And by decomposing that QK outer product, what I'll show here is that we can actually find where the two latent variables Z1 and Z2 are being encoded in this QK space. And so to do so, what we need is what I call a positive and negative covariance term. So starting with the positive side, let's first assume just a single latent variable Z1. And so here what we need to do is we're going to look for all Q and K vectors. We're going to filter through query and key vectors where the pair shares the same first latent variable. So maybe in this case, both Q and K have like value 1, 1, -1 for Z1. And we're also going to filter for cases where the key's second latent variable is equal to some constant value. So maybe here this Z2 value is just 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. And so we're going to filter for all cases where the key's second latent variable is some constant. On the negative side, we're going to do something very similar, but now we're going to filter for cases where the key and query vectors don't share the same first latent variable. But in terms of the second latent variable, we're still looking for cases where the second latent variable is equal to the same constant value. Right? So the difference between the positive side and negative side is the fact that between the Q's and K's, the first latent variable is either the same or not the same between the queries and keys. But when it comes to the second latent variable, they're all equal to some constant. And the reason why we set it up this way is because eventually, like once we have our Q's and K's filtered out this way, we can construct their covariance term, or just you can think of it just as the outer product of these. And we're going to just subtract one from the other. And so essentially, so I call this the contrastive covariance term. And because the Z2, the latent variable for Z2 has been fixed in both the positive and negative case, this will end up canceling each other out in this subtraction. And so what's left in this contrastive covariance object is the difference that arises simply from Z1 being either equal or not equal. And so this basically captures, long story short, this basically captures where Z1 is being encoded in your QK space. And once you have like once you've localized where Z1 is encoded in its contrastive covariance object, you can simply take the SVD to find where Z1 is being encoded in the query side as well as on the key side. Right, and so you can repeat this for the second latent variable, Z2. Let me take a pause here to see if there are questions.
Could you explain how you got the positive and negative covariances again, or like how that's defined?
Yeah. So coming back to this picture, so this is coming from a single training sample, but we're looking for key vectors here. For the positive case, we're looking for cases where this query and key vector share the same Z1 value. So it's probably going to be let's pretend like the second payload embedding shares the same Z1 value. And so that would fall under the positive case, whereas all the other ones would fall under the negative case because they don't share the same Z1 value. So that explains like this first part. We're looking for keys and queries that either match or don't match in Z1. But we're also doing the second filtering step where for all of the keys, we only care about keys that where the second latent variable is equal to some constant. So we're going to assume like we only care about cases where Z2 are both like say 1 1 1 1 1 or something like that. And the reason why we need to keep the second latent variable fixed is because essentially eventually we're going to subtract these two terms out, and so we want this Z2 term to cancel out in their outer product. I wish I had a different picture here. Maybe let me actually go back to one of the very first slides. So here in this picture, like imagine this is our resulting QK space. And imagine like the green part is where like your Z1 components are being encoded, and the orange part is where Z2 is being encoded. But effectively, if like your Z2 variables, so imagine we have something like this for the positive and negative case. But if the orange part, the part corresponding to Z2 are the same between the positive and negative case, when you subtract them out, they're going to basically zero out. And so you're left only with this green component, which is effectively where like the first latent variable Z1 is being encoded. I don't know if that was helpful.
Does it make sense to think of this as like controlling for Z2 in the sense like you're trying to find a covariance within one variable, so you don't want the other one to be varying as well?
Yeah, you said it better than I did. That's exactly what we want to do.
Okay, that's helpful.
Right. And so once you do the SVD on this contrastive covariance term, then because like when we're constructing the outer product, because we have the Q on the left and K on the right, your left singular values or left singular vectors end up encoding where Z1 is on the query side in your query space, and your right singular vectors encode where Z1 is encoded in your key space. And so with this SVD, this gives you basically three things. One is you get for free kind of the rank of your latent variables. And the way we compute that is we basically just count up the number of singular values in the SVD that account for 99% of the mass of basically your Frobenius norm here. So that gives you the effective rank of basically Z1. And then, right. And so if you just consider the first R1 left or right singular vectors, that gives you a basis in query space and key space where your latent variable is being encoded. And so here is some empirical evidence of this working. So here, there's a lot going on in this plot, but here we trained a very small model with like 8 dimensions. Like the attention head only has 8 dimensions, and we've trained on various task settings. So here on the X and Y axis is different settings where the 2 latent variables have different lengths. So these are values for R1, these are values for R2. And then each value in here in each cell is basically the recovered rank using our contrastive covariance approach. And you can see that when the attention head has enough dimensions, it's able to recover the correct rank of our 2 latent variables. So here, for instance, in this setting, we trained an attention head where Z1 and Z2 each have length 3. And that, of course, fits within 8 dimensions. And so the model is able to recover the correct rank of our 2 latent variables. And that corresponds to each of the cells here. Like if you add the 2 values here, these are cases where they all are equal to or less than 8. And so in that case, the model does retrieve the correct rank of our latent variables. And anything beyond this outside in this lower right-hand side is a case of, I guess, superposition, where the 2 latent variables don't fit in 8 dimensions. And so the model has to kind of compact that in somehow using less dimensions than available. I'll take a pause here, see if there are questions. I think the more exciting part is this next part. So now that we know the rank of each of our 2 latent variables, Z1 and Z2, again, if you just take the first R1 left singular vectors or first R1 right singular vectors, that gives you a basis in query space and key space, respectively, where this latent variable is encoded. And so we can actually visualize this quite easily. So imagine a case where the first latent variable only has rank 3. And so if you consider all the possible values that our first latent variable can take on, which is plus or minus 1, plus or minus 1, plus or minus 1, this ends up being the vertices of some cube. And what we can do is we can take all of our key vectors, all of our query vectors, and project them onto this left and right singular vectors where I'm saying Z1 is being encoded. So we're projecting this down to a 3-dimensional space and then running PCA on those projections. And with that, you actually end up recovering exactly the cube where Z1 is being encoded. So here again, each cluster basically corresponds to a possible value for Z1. So in this case, the red ones correspond to 1, 1, -1. And then here, the plus signs and circles basically correspond to either keys or queries. And so the other thing to notice is that the keys and queries are in alignment because when the keys and queries share the same value, they're being projected to the same cluster. And so you can very easily visualize Z1 being encoded in this 3-dimensional space. Does that part make sense? Okay. Right. So, but this is just a visualization of like the left and right singular vectors encoding Z1. But to be sure, we can do causal interventions. And so the way we're going to do this is like in our data, we originally have some payload that the model has been trained to attend to. But we're going to pick some arbitrary other embedding and call that our target embedding. And we want to intervene basically in this 3-dimensional subspace where Z1 is encoded. We're going to intervene in that subspace and make the model attend to this other target time step instead. So what we're going to do, the way we do this is we're going to project all of our payload embeddings using WK, but we're going to project these key vectors so with our contrastive covariance term, once you do SVD, again, your right singular vectors are encoding Z1. And in fact, the first 3 dimensions are encoding Z1. And so we're going to basically project our key vectors into the 3-dimensional subspace using the first 3 right singular vectors. And we're basically just going to swap the coordinates in this 3-dimensional subspace between the original time step and the target time step. And then once we've done, right, so the one way to visualize this is in this 3-dimensional subspace, we're swapping the position of these 2 key vectors in this 3-dimensional subspace, and then we're going to project this back out to the key space and then proceed our computation. So that's like a lot of notations and symbols down here, but the idea is basically swapping coordinates between 2 key vectors in this 3-dimensional subspace, and then seeing how attention scores change once you do that. Did that part make sense? I can take questions if that was unclear. Otherwise, I'll keep going. So here, I'll show you the results on how attention patterns change with our intervention. So originally, the model spends all of its attention on the original time step before any causal intervention. But if we intervene on the subspace where either Z1 or Z2 is being encoded, you can shift some of the attention over to our arbitrary target time step. And if you combined this and actually intervene on both subspaces, both where Z1 is encoded and both also where Z2 is encoded, then you can actually shift all the attention over to some other time step. And as random baseline controls, we have, this is if you were to intervene on some random 3-dimensional subspace. This one is if you were to intervene on some random 5-dimensional subspace, 5 being like R2's value. And then this is if you were to intervene on some other, on both random subspaces. You don't see the attention being shifted to the target time step that way. Yeah, I see a question on Zoom.
So when you're doing this intervention, do you see the attention moves somewhere else other than original and target?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think essentially, we didn't take a close look, I guess, but essentially how do we say this? So I think when we intervene on some random subspace here, I think essentially what will happen is whichever, so let's use this 3D visualization. Like if we were to, instead of cleanly swapping in this 3-dimensional, in these coordinates, let's say we're intervening on some random space somewhere out here that doesn't fall nicely into this cube. And I think what will essentially happen is whichever key vectors that have their coordinates closest to that arbitrary space outside of this cube will end up absorbing some of that attention. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but if you go, can you go back to the bar plot?
Yeah.
So yeah, it looks like when you intervene on like for like just a Z1, if I sum it, it's probably around like probably 50,
Yeah.
like around
Yeah.
0.5 in total for original and target. So when you do a random compared to random R1, it's like looks like most of the attention is still gonna be on the original or target. But for the Z1, like half of the attention goes somewhere else.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. Yeah.
So I wonder what does that might imply or indicate?
Yeah, I think in that case, what's happening is like some of the payload embeddings share the same C2 value as our query, and I think those are probably being absorbed. The attention is being spent probably on those tokens then, which isn't being depicted in these bars.
Okay, I see. And also, I don't know whether or not it's just over conjecture, but I noticed that the change the change in attention to target is larger for Z2 compared to Z1. Do you think it might be because the rank of Z2 is higher than the rank of
Yeah. That's
Z1?
definitely why.
Oh, but
Yeah, it's I think it's essentially because the way we set this up, like all of our target values can only have one or negative one. And so if you try to, if this isn't very formal, but if you consider the quote unquote volume that Z1 and Z2 can take, they directly then correspond to the number of ranks they have. Like we're essentially limiting, um, I guess, the norms of Z1 and Z2 that way. So yeah, so then if you have higher rank, then you're gonna have a higher causal effect on the resulting attention. In real attention heads, I don't think there is such constraint. So having higher rank doesn't necessarily mean you affect attention more, but in our case, it would.
got it. Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Just for clarification, so is it correct that I origin, I target are tokens? So how many other tokens are there that it could possibly attend to?
Yeah, I should have specified. I want to say there were maybe 12 or 16 or something in that range. 10 or 12 or 16, one of those values.
And so, like Trang mentioned, it seems like half of the attention is being spread across like all of those other ones. Like, was it roughly uniform, or was like how did it compare to the two here?
I don't think we looked, but I don't think it would be uniform. It would depend on what values of Z1 and Z2 the other tokens have. Yeah, and the other thing here is like even when you intervene on some random subspace of here, I guess rank 8, like 3 plus 5, because the overall attention head only has 16 dimensions, like if you randomly poke around on 8 dimensions, that ends up affecting, I guess, one of the two subspaces. But if you had a much higher number of dimensions for the attention head and your latent variables were really small, like in our case, 3 and 5, in comparison, then like this random intervention result would be much lower. Which is what we see in like the real large language model results.
Okay, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, in the interest of time, let me try to go through the real like LLM results, and then I can take questions at the end. I think the real LLM results will be easier to go through. So in this case, we looked at two cases of like kind of interesting attention behaviors. One is what people call filter heads, and the other is binding features. And so filter heads are cases where the attention head mirrors quote unquote filter functions in programming languages. Where here, if you give a query like cat, apple, dog, truck, orange, tea, car, duck, and you ask find the fruits, you interestingly end up seeing attention heads that attend to the fruits here. Same thing if you, oh, right. So in this case, our positive and negative covariance terms are very simple. the positive case are just being constructed by taking the keys that satisfy the query. So here it'd be apple and oranges, and all other tokens that aren't fruits would fall under the negative covariance term. So that's where the keys are coming from. But the query vector we're taking just from the last time step. And again, you just subtract them to compute the contrastive covariance term. And this was for fruits, but you can imagine doing the same thing for, say, animals. So in this case, now cat, dog, and duck fall under the positive covariance term and everything else under the negative, and so on. So this is for vehicles and so on. Long story short, okay, yeah. So we do this for 5 categories: animals, countries, fruits, liquid, and vehicle. I'm actually going to skip over this part, but if you basically just if you do the whole SVD thing and take the first singular vectors for each of these 5 categories and take their span as the quote unquote category semantic space, you end up seeing a very nice PCA visualization here. It's actually maybe a bit hard to see when it's static like this, when it's frozen, but what you're essentially seeing here is 5 clusters here on the query side for the 5 different categories, and then 5 clusters here on the key side, again, for the categories. Right, so the pluses correspond to queries, the circles correspond to keys, and then you see this nice symmetry. So this is a part that's confusing to see in this frozen version, but here you see the countries align, the fruits align, the liquids align, the animals align, and then the vehicles align. I know I went through that quite quickly. Maybe I shouldn't have. Let me take a pause here and see if this made sense.
If you can break this down a bit, so each of these dots is the uh the key query the key or query embedding
Yes.
at a certain position in
Yes.
that prompt. Is that correct?
It is, yes, projected down to a 3-dimensional space that corresponds to where we believe semantics is being encoded in the attention head. So
Okay,
yeah,
got
let me go back, sorry. So for each of our 5 categories, we computed our contrastive covariance. And so here, if we take the first like left or right singular vectors, we're saying that's where, say, like vehicles is being encoded. Right? And same thing on the animal side. If we did this whole thing with animals, then like the left and right singular vectors are encoding where encodes animal information on the query side and key side, respectively. And so all we do is we take the first left singular vectors for animal, country, fruit, liquid, and vehicles, and take their span as just broadly the category subspace. Same thing on the key space, I guess. We take the right singular vectors, the first right singular vectors for animal, country, fruit, liquid, and vehicle, take their span and consider that to be the category subspace. So I actually don't know if this is the case, but assuming these are orthogonal vectors, then we're left with a 5-dimensional subspace on key side and query side. And then what we're doing is then, like you said, taking all the key vectors and then projecting these key vectors onto that 5-dimensional subspace and then doing PCA on that 5-dimensional subspace.
I see. Got it. And I'm just curious, if we change the prompt, like change the task to be find the word that start with C, for example, do you think that this graph will still gonna look like this? Like the
That's a good
categories?
question. That's a good question. It would depend on whether we can find attention heads that solve that task meaningfully. Like if you don't see an attention head produce the attention patterns that we care about, then it's not going to produce any meaningful kind of um, feature patterns, I suppose.
Okay.
Right, because Right. Essentially, we care about trying to understand this attention pattern. And so if there's no meaningful attention pattern being produced by that query, then um, I don't think there'd be much to look at. That's a good question. And it, yeah, essentially comes down to whether we see any behaviorally meaningful or interesting attention pattern. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Um, so this is if you expand the setup to 13 categories. Now in this case, I'm only showing you the keys and not the queries. And we see once again clear semantic clustering show up. So, whoops. So for instance, here we have birds and animals. Here we have food and liquid. Here we have male and female names. Here we have cities, states, and countries. Okay, and we can also go beyond visualization and do the same causal intervention stuff, where we're going to project. Oh, so in this case, here the model attends to apple because that's the only fruit. But we're going to pick some arbitrary target token like car, and we're going to intervene in that five-dimensional subspace and change the coordinates in there so that now car is encoding a fruit in that five-dimensional subspace, and apple is encoding something else. So it's basically the same thing we did in our toy setup, just changing the coordinates in this five-dimensional subspace. And by doing so, we can basically move some of the attention over from the original time step, the apple token, to whichever other token we arbitrarily picked. And then in this case, with a random baseline of intervening on some random five-dimensional subspace, we don't see the same effect. The other one is also, I think, quite fun. Here we're looking at binding. And so what I mean by that is if you have a query like the hat is in box O, the gem is in box Z, cat is in box B, and so on, and you ask which box is the gem in, you see the model attend to the correct box, box Z. But prior work actually shows that there are multiple mechanisms by which the model solves this task. And so this is where, again, we can use the whole tagging notion. And so what prior work shows is that one type of quote unquote tag is that the model just keeps track of the order in which these items show up in. And so the hat and box O shows up first. So that's tag one or value one. Jam in box Z, two, cat in box B, three, book in J4. And so now when the model is when we're asking where is the jam, because jam is also tagged with two, the model knows that jam showed up second. It's going to look for the box that also showed up second. So people call this the order ID feature, I guess, order ID tag. Whereas the lexical tag is the intuitive solution that I guess we as humans would probably use, where for each box token, it's actually tagging the token with the correct lexical term. So box O has, let's imagine it's being tagged with the token hat, C tagged with jam, B tagged with cat, and J. And so given jam, it can simply use this to look up the box with the correct tag. Or so I guess people call this tag the lexical ID tag. And so now we can construct positive and negative covariance terms based on these two features. So starting with order ID, what we can do is we can use the correct key that has the correct order ID as the query as our positive case, and all other keys with other order IDs as our negative case. But here, importantly, what we have to do is we have to keep the actual entity tokens and box tokens fixed across all of our samples. And so we're always going to use the tokens hat, jam, cat, book, and box O, Z, B, and J, even though their order is being shuffled across samples. On the other hand, in order to extract and localize lexical ID, now we have to construct counterfactual pairs where we have the same exact query in the counterfactual case, but now we're only going to change the lexical identity of what's being queried. and then use the box token in this counterfactual case as our negative covariance term. And so in this case, unlike before, now both the order ID, right? So this way we can isolate the order ID subspace and the lexical ID subspace. And interestingly, it seems like order ID has typically, say, like rank 3, and lexical subspace has rank like 10-ish. And so same thing as before, we're going to project our keys into this 3-dimensional order ID subspace or 10-dimensional lexical subspace for keys and queries. And you see, again, this nice clustering based on order. And so here, these clusters, so again, you see queries and keys. The pluses, again, are queries, circles are keys, and you see this nice ordering based on the order. So this goes from order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then you again see this nice alignment between keys and queries. So this is for the 3-dimensional order ID case. In the 10-dimensional lexical case, it's harder to visualize in 3D. But if you use UMAP as your visualization, you do still see nice clustering based on the lexical identity. You see some of this alignment between keys and queries with PCA. But again, we're dealing with 10-dimensional subspaces, and so it's harder to visualize. And same thing as before, with causal interventions, the idea is we're going to project keys onto either the 3-dimensional order ID subspace or the 10-dimensional lexical ID subspace, and then change the coordinates in there to change where the attention head attends to. And so you see the same results as before. Initially, the model would attend to the correct token, say like box J or whatever. But if you intervene on the 3-dimensional subspace where we believe order is being encoded, or the 10-dimensional subspace where lexical term is being encoded and swap the coordinates there, you can move some of the attention over. And of course, if you intervene on both subspace, you can shift the majority of the attention over. And you don't see the same pattern with random 3-dimensional, 10-dimensional, or 13-dimensional subspaces. Okay, so I'm going to conclude here. Here, basically, we've proposed a way of decomposing this QK space into interpretable components and demonstrated that it's essentially the coordinates in these subspaces that decide what a feature value is. But some limitations with this work is that you have to know ahead of time what features you're looking for in order to construct these contrastive covariance terms. Like you have to know how to construct your positive and negative pairs. And to be quite honest, like this method is quite sensitive to how cleanly these positive and negative pairs have been designed. And so it'd be nice if there were a way to scale this more easily with something analogous to SAEs where some unsupervised approach can identify these low rank feature subspaces. And I guess coming back to that SAE question at the very beginning with rank 1, like linear features, what we're essentially showing here is that I think rank 1 linear directions is a wrong unit of an interpretable feature because we're showing that in these like low rank subspaces, it's really the coordinates that decide what a feature value should be. So I think this also updates us on how we should be thinking about how to design SAE architectures. Okay, thank you for your attention. I know we're out of time, but I'm happy to, if people want to stick around, I'm happy to answer questions, or you can also reach out to me via email, and I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
of course.
Oh, Sankaran, if you are talking, we're not hearing you, by the way.
Oh, I didn't say anything. By the way, so you had one-on-one, like one-on-one meetings, like 20 minutes each, but it looks like the second person can't make it. Last minute conflict happened. So I think for the other two, it actually might make more sense to have like half an hour. Okay. That makes sense. So I think
Yeah. Yeah, and that was a different Zoom link.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I think I have it in my email somewhere.
Oh, I can just send you another copy if that's easier.
I have it open, I think.
Okay, great. Bye, Andrew. I'm gonna see you
Bye.
at 1:30 there. Bye bye.
Bye.